So now I'd like to introduce Prue Hyman. Prue Hyman was a feminist economist at the Victoria University of Wellington, an academic there. She worked for the New Zealand Ministry of Women's Affairs when it was a real feminist place. She helped organise the Women's Studies Association and has been on the board of the International Association of Feminist Economics. She assisted the lawyers and unions with the Christine Bartlett versus Terra Nova Equal Pay Act case and is active in the living wage movement. Her 1994 book, Women and Economics, a New Zealand Feminist Perspective, was updated in 2017. She has written extensively on lesbian issues and has been an active broadcaster on lesbian radio. So Prue, would you please tell us about yourself and your activism and what issue or issues currently concerns you the most?
I'm getting on in years these days, and so I've been involved around feminist lesbian activities for 40 years or so, and I've mostly been involved in, as an academic, I had to, be a little bit careful, and I was involved mostly in women and work type stuff, paid and unpaid work, but I also worked a fair bit on lesbian issues as well, and got my students activated, which was pretty important too, and some of them still are, which is excellent. These days, I'm retired from paid work, which is a great relief in many ways, except for that I miss my students. And so I've got a bit more time to put in to these new things. We thought, of course, as feminists and as lesbians, that we'd accomplished a lot over the years. And indeed, in some ways we had. But these latest threats to us from what's going on both in Aotearoa, New Zealand and around the world are really serious. And what the others have referred to already, I'm very equally working on. I particularly work within LAVA, the lesbian, it's a revived organisation that was around in the 80s when we were fighting for homosexual law reform with the guys, and for human rights, of course, legislation that would encompass lesbians. And we got the first in 1986 and the second not until 1993. And after that, we tended to sort of take a bit of a breather on some of the issues and think we'd accomplished quite a lot. Some people worked for lesbian and gay marriage. That's not an enthusiasm of mine, since I'm not for simply saying we are just the same as you. But there we go. That's an issue that's a little bit on tonight. But the latest threat to both women in general and lesbians in particular is really serious, because the extremists of the transgender movement, of course, we believe in transgender human rights like anybody else's human rights, but the extremists of the transgender movement are really threatening lesbian and women's rights, and the pretense that they are not is a real worry. And in particular, also, they are actually deplatforming us worldwide, from J.K. Rowling and Julie Bindel and Sheila Jeffries to people in New Zealand as well. We are being not even permitted to say what's going on, and we have to fight like mad, as Beth will talk about with this UFW, to even get a platform, to get a space to talk. And the one I'm particularly concentrating on at the moment is hate speech, which, along with the conversion therapy and the Birth, Deaths and Marriages Act, they all link together to threaten us. And on the hate speech, hasn't reached the drafting of the legislation yet, but it has had a discussion paper that LAVA put in a submission on, that I did the first draft of, to say that really we shouldn't be strengthening hate speech legislation at all, although free speech has to have some limits. The worry is who decides and so on. And so that's the area on which I'm working most at the moment.
How does the issue which concerns you, you've mentioned hate speech is what you're focusing on, how does that affect women's sex-based rights, and what can be done to uphold our rights?
in some ways, hate speech seems less important than the other issues that have been raised, but of course they're all so damn linked. And at the moment, they're behaving, a lot of the media, government departments, as Jan's explained, are behaving as though it was hate speech to question that trans women are women, and already, even though there is no legislation that justifies it at present. The Human Rights Act hasn't changed. The Birth, Death and Marriages Act haven't changed yet. Conversion therapy is, none of that is through yet. And yet government departments are behaving as though they had been changed, as though it was already quite clear that gender triumphs over sex, that, or even that they get elided. People pretend that they are not different. And I think that's one of the things we have to push for like mad, is that sex cannot be changed. Okay, there is a possibility of changing it on the birth certificate now, but that is a legal fiction in a way that everybody knows, that basic sex cannot be changed. Gender identity is another matter, which is a very interesting and difficult one, on which there's a huge literature. A lot of us do not feel the need to say anything about gender. We are sexually adult females, and that is our sex. We are women, and that's all there is to it. But the problem is that even now, without any extensions to hate speech legislation, people are really scared about saying what they really think. Loads of people are being having trouble in their workplaces because of it. In New Zealand, as much as anywhere else, it hasn't had as much publicity here, but people are getting fired, people are getting deplatformed. That's without any extension to the hate speech legislation. If we get the hate speech legislation, we don't have the bill yet, but we have the recommendations from a working group. That working group was set up because of the appalling Christchurch mosque attacks, which of course we are all horrified by, but the commission that wrote out of that recommended an extension to hate speech legislation, and then this working group has recommended changes. It's called for submissions, which have now closed, and we've all put in submissions on that. We will get another bite at the cherry, of course, when the actual legislation is drafted. But it's a real worry. It will involve also changes to the Human Rights Act, where it's recommended that gender is put in, hopefully in addition to sex, but even then that will create a hell of a mess as to entirely a matter of interpretation. And so it really is very, very important that we indicate that free speech is essential. It's us that are getting silenced. And it's ironic that the left-wing, traditional left-wingers are in favour of all this extensions to hate speech and the whole, in favour of everything that the transgender movement wants to happen, and the right wing are against it. That causes a lot of problems for a lot of us. But nevertheless, it's essential that that we fight against the changes, any changes that come into that are proposed for hate speech legislation, just as we fight against the other changes that the others have already mentioned.
What do you think we can do going forward to protect women's sex-based rights?
I agree with everybody else. We've got to do all those things. We've got to act on all fronts. And I think, some people are better at some things than others. Some are better at submissions. Some are better at cartoons. Some are better at organising street marches and so on. I think we've got to try and do everything. We've got somehow to try and scare the politicians. At the moment, there just isn't enough awareness that there are a hell of a lot of people who don't agree with them. And of course, at grassroots level, as Di said, a hell of a lot of people don't know anything about this still. Even even people that are quite well informed normally on things. It's only recently that media's covered much of it at all, and it's covered it in such a totally biased way that our points don't get across. I mean, some people are very faithful. Jill Abigail always has got letters in the paper and so on, and the listeners covered it a bit, but there's been very, very little on our side, and it's very hard to get it. So and yet there are surveys that say that, you know, 60% of people think it's nonsense for Laurel Hubbard to be representing New Zealand as a woman. When you do actually get to ordinary people, they think it's a nonsense. And the only way you can really, I think, we can really pull it back is by getting much, much larger numbers on our side and knowing about it and making a fuss about it. And, you know, we all have to work really hard on that in whichever way we can. And I absolutely agree with getting to the streets when we can, and also getting on trying to influence more people. I don't know. I'm not a social media person that's an expert. How the heck do we get to the whole grassroots? That's what I'd really like to do.